Most cold cases don't end. They fade quietly as years pass and witnesses disappear. But sometimes, decades later, police identify a suspect, not through a confession, not through an arrest, through DNA, after the person they believe is responsible is already dead. In today's episode, we are going to look at 3 cases that took decades to solve. The women at the center of these cases were Christine Prince, Claire Sampson, and Gracelyn Greenidge, 3 women whose deaths occurred over a 15-year period and initially appeared completely unrelated. Christine Prince was 25 years old when she disappeared on June 21, 1982, after last being seen on a Toronto streetcar along St. Clair Avenue West. Her body was later discovered in the Rouge River, but at the time, investigators had little to connect her case to any other crime. Claire Sampson was 23 when she was last seen in downtown Toronto on September 1, 1983. Her body was found the following day in Oro-Medonte Township, north of the city, a location and set of circumstances that caused her case to be treated as isolated for decades. Gracelyn Greenidge was 41 years old when she was found deceased in her Toronto apartment on July 29, 1997. Her death, separated by years and context from the earlier cases, was investigated on its own, with no indication at the time that it was connected to any other homicide. At the time of each investigation, nothing in these women's lives or deaths suggested a connection, and their cases moved forward as 3 separate tragedies with no shared suspect. When these cases were first investigated, police were limited by the era they were working in. DNA evidence could be collected, but without a comparison sample, it could not identify a suspect. There were no national databases, no genetic genealogy tools, and little ability to connect cases separated by years and geography. Evidence was preserved, but the investigation stalled as leads ran out. Years later, as part of a broader cold case review, historical files were reorganized and revisited, including assistance from law students connected to Osgoode Hall Law School, helping make decades-old cases usable again for modern review. When Toronto police announced the identification, they were deliberate in how they described what this investigation was and what it was not. In their official release, police said the identification came after extensive forensic testing and genetic genealogy, emphasizing that the work unfolded gradually rather than through a sudden breakthrough. Officers described the process as careful and incremental, guided by verification rather than urgency. Police were also clear about the limits of DNA itself. They explained that genetic genealogy does not identify a suspect directly, but narrows extended family lines until investigators can rule possibilities in or out. One senior officer said the conclusion was reached only after results consistently pointed in the same direction, and only once investigators were confident the findings could withstand scrutiny. Importantly, police stressed that this was not a criminal prosecution. They described the outcome as an identification based on the available evidence, not a finding tested in court. They acknowledged openly that there would be no opportunity for cross-examination, no defense response, and no judicial ruling, a reality that shaped how cautiously information was released. Toronto police also addressed the question of what comes next. They stated that the investigation remains open, noting that identification does not rule out the possibility of additional victims. At the same time, they avoided speculation, saying only what the evidence supports and nothing beyond it. That evidence led police to identify Kenneth Smith as the man they believe was responsible for all 3 murders. Police said Smith met the definition of a serial killer based on multiple victims across separate incidents. But because Smith died in 2019, the case could go no further within the justice system. For the families of the 3 women, the identification brought relief mixed with frustration. After decades of uncertainty, there was finally a name, but no courtroom and no chance to hear evidence tested in public. Kenneth Smith had died in 2019, meaning the case could never move beyond identification into prosecution. Police have said Smith later lived in Windsor, Ontario, without public scrutiny, and have not alleged additional crimes there. They have also stated the work remains open, acknowledging the possibility of other victims who may never be identified. Christine Prince, Claire Sampson, Gracelyn Greenidge. For decades, their deaths remained separate, unresolved, and largely forgotten outside their families. They were only connected years later, not through witnesses or arrests, but through science revisiting what time had left behind. What police were able to provide was an answer, not accountability. There was no trial, no verdict, just names, finally spoken together, and a justice system reaching its limits. Thanks for staying with us after the episode. Leah, one thing that stood out to me while working on this was how little personal information we actually have about the victims and even about Kenneth Smith himself.
Yeah, and that wasn't accidental. Police were very careful in what they released. This wasn't a case going to trial, so there was no obligation, and really no reason, to put everything on the public record.
Which is so different from cases we've covered, where a courtroom becomes the place where details spill out. Here, there was no trial, no cross-examination, no public testing of evidence.
Exactly. And I don't think police were holding back in a suspicious way. I think they were acknowledging the limits of what this process could ethically support. Naming a suspect who can't respond is already delicate.
We've seen this before on the show. Cases where answers arrive without accountability. Melanie Carpenter comes to mind. You get clarity, but not resolution in the way people expect.
And for families, that can cut both ways. Some finally get relief, confirmation that they weren't forgotten, that there was an answer. But closure? That's not guaranteed. Closure usually comes from process, not just information.
Exactly right. And a name explains what happened. A trial explains how and why. And here, that second part is missing forever.
Which is why the lack of detail matters. Not because we're owed more as the public, but because the justice system itself never got to finish its work.
And that's the hard truth of this case. Science moved faster than time, but not fast enough to bring this into a courtroom.
What's left is acknowledgement, saying the women's names, recognizing the impact, and understanding that sometimes answers arrive too late to look like justice.
If you've been listening to Northern Dark for a while, you know this isn't an isolated story. It's part of a pattern we keep returning to. What happens when the system runs out of road?
And why telling these stories carefully still matters. If you're following the case or thinking about the questions it raises, join the conversation with us on social media. We read your comments, and the discussion there helps shape how we cover stories like this going forward.
As always, we appreciate you listening and engaging with these conversations thoughtfully. We'll see you next Monday. Until then, take care of each other.